Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Behind the Librarians, Book Bans, Censorship, and Religious Freedom, a conversation with director producer Kim A. Snyder. My name is Katie Ryder, and I am the National Director of Jews for a Secular Democracy. Tonight's event is hosted by the Jewish Women and Religious Freedom in Pittsburgh Project. This is a multi-year project that is funded by the Jewish Women's Foundation of Greater Pittsburgh, underwritten in part by Trustee Nancy Weissman in memory of her beloved mother-in-law, Trustee Jackie Wexler. Tonight's program, is presented in partnership with the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh and the Judith, and I hope I pronounce this correctly, Fingeret Krug First Amendment Fund of the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. At a moment when access to books is increasingly under attack across the country, we truly appreciate all of you for joining us this evening for this timely and urgent conversation. Before we get started, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping and say that we will be taking questions, but please put them in the Q&A function. That is the easier way for us to handle them and to see them. And now let's get started. Let me introduce our moderators for tonight. Both of our moderators are members of the Jewish Women and Religious Freedom in Pittsburgh Steering Committee, and I am truly grateful to both of them for their work on this project and everything they've done over the last few years. Our first moderator, Stefanie Maclin-Hurd, is a librarian, a parent, a book collector, and an advocate. She has 15 years experience in libraries, including a public library consortia. She currently works as a research librarian at a law firm. For the last decade, Stefanie has been focusing on advocacy through books. She is a firm believer in using stories to promote diversity, inclusion, and a kinder world. Our second moderator, Carrie Wardzinski, is a lifelong Greater Pittsburgh area resident, a librarian, and a community advocate who cares deeply about access to information and ideas. Her work and activism have focused on protecting intellectual freedom and ensuring that all people have the opportunity to encounter a wide range of perspectives. As both a parent and a librarian, Carrie has seen firsthand how books can open doors, build empathy, and help people understand the world around them. She's honored to co-moderate tonight's conversation and to help create space for a thoughtful and meaningful discussion. Welcome and thank you to you both, and I'm going to turn over the floor to you.
All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you're here for this very important topic. So as was mentioned, I've been doing some personal advocacy within book banning for about a decade now, and I have worked in libraries in some capacity for 15 years now. And I'm a strong believer in that books can change the world, and that in limiting what people are able to read, we are limiting the way in which our society and our communities are able to be stronger, kinder, and more prepared to deal with anything that is thrown at us. I'm a huge advocate for diverse and inclusive stories, and I am looking forward to talking with Kim Snyder about this very important topic.
Thank you, Stefanie. And my name is Carrie Wardzinski, and this is a very important topic for me personally, because I have seen how books have opened up the world for my son. He was a reluctant reader, and it wasn't until he discovered the Percy Jackson series and saw himself in those books as a child who is diagnosed with ADHD that he really, responded to that. But even more so, it's also important to me because I've seen firsthand the devastation that censorship and book banning have brought to the United States, but also Western Pennsylvania, where I reside. I've seen librarians be torn down. I have seen where people are not represented in the books, and that has been a problem. I think when this documentary and this conversation is really important because it not only centers the importance of diverse collections, but also centers the expertise of librarians, which has been devalued in this process. So it's important to talk about both. And I'm also going to go ahead and introduce our guest of honor here, Kim Snyder. Now, since its 2025 Sundance world premiere, the Librarians has garnered 26 festival awards and played in 200 plus theaters around the globe. We're honored to have Academy Award nominee and Peabody Award winning director producer Kim A. Snyder here for a conversation after the screening. Her most recent short documentary, Death by Numbers, co created with gun violence survivor Sam Fuentes, was nominated for a 2025 Academy Award. Snyder's acclaimed films include Us Kids, shown at Sundance in 2020, Lessons from a School Shooting, which was a Netflix original, Newtown, which was shown at Sundance in 2016, and a Peabody Award winner and also on PBS, and many others. She also associate produced the award-winning short Trevor, which spawned the Trevor Project. Let's start at the beginning. So Kim, what first drew you to the issue of book bans and censorship, and what made you realize that this was a story that needed a documentary and more attention?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me. It's a very welcome and wonderful initiative that I feel honored to be part of. So thanks for having me tonight. But as you can see from my resume, I worked in the last decade a lot in the space of gun violence. And a lot of the stories I've told in the nonfiction space have found me. There's a sort of charisma that sometimes happens. There's a combination of happenstance and instinct and attraction, something you can't really explain about why these stories happen. But I was in this space of chronicling a lot of kind of bearing witness and the ripple effects of grief, and something sadly Pittsburgh knows all too well, and did spend years in these a couple of the communities that suffered these devastating gun violence. And then it was my last film was about students that rose up after their shooting in Parkland, Florida, and it was COVID. And I saw this story on the news. I was sort of, where am I going next? And it was a story about a state representative in Texas named Kraus, who had issued a list of 850 books that school libraries should review and remove from the shelves. And it was immediately apparent that these books were very singularly targeting almost exclusively books with marginalized voices, books about the LGBT plus community, books authored by Black authors, books about Black history, anything that was other, and of course anything that had any kind of sex education references. And these were often random, almost from titles taken out of context. And then I learned about a small group of librarians in Texas calling themselves the Freedom Fighters. This was the fall of 21, who were beginning to connect, organize, and react. And I quickly just had an instinct about this. And in those early days, Carolyn Foote, who's in the beginning of the film, and one of those initial librarians said, we are the canaries in the coal mine, and watch, because you are going to see this happening more in the public library space. And little did I know how prescient for this 4 years that we chronicled this this whole journey, that it would be permeating our museums and our colleges and really every aspect of society. So here we are 4 years later. Sadly, the film is, more relevant than we could have ever known. But on the upside, we've done amazing things with it in the last year to raise awareness.
Thank you so much for making this film and all of the important work that you have done and, brought to people's awareness through your films. Obviously, this is in a very important topic, and I think that when people think about book bannings and censorship, they don't understand sometimes how widespread it actually can be and what all is actually being challenged, and the fact that there's titles there that they're not necessarily considering. And that brings us to the next question in regards to maybe why some of these bans are happening. Is that in the film you interviewed one librarian who raised a powerful question about the groups driving many of these book bans, whether their goal is political power, financial gain, or advancing a Christian nationalist vision for the country or everyone who lives there. From your reporting and interviews, how do you understand the forces that are behind this movement, and what do you think their goals are?
First of all, I see someone saying louder. Can you hear me well now? I just used a little external mic. Can you hear me okay? Are you hearing me? No? Hang on a second.
I can hear you okay, Kim.
You can?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure that that mic worked because I thought maybe it would help. So the journey of making this in 4 years was one from starting to collaborate with these librarians in Texas, understanding that things were as draconian and difficult in Florida. But then realizing that they were hearing from librarians all over the country and we needed to make this a more national story. And so we did. And we land in New Jersey with Martha Hickson, who really begins in the storyline to connect dots. And as you say, I start to peel the onion and look, what is the deeper forces behind this? And what I have come to understand, and there's a really interesting character, spoiler, for those who haven't seen the film, a woman named Courtney Gore from Texas, who's a Republican, and she starts out believing that there is obscenity in the grade schools. She does her research. She's on the school board, and she ran for the school board on this platform of being a zealot book banner, if you will, and learns that there is no there, that she's been sort of sold a bill of goods. So she is the one in the film, along with others, who kind of expose that there is a much deeper nefarious money and agenda, and that it really is about taking down public education, that there are larger forces that are white Christian nationalist, Project 2025 akin agendas to really have no separation of church and state when it comes to the materials in the school libraries. And that it's a larger agenda to encourage diversion of funds, as I understand it, to Bible schools, basically. So that's what I see as the larger import. And I think it's important to contextualize the film that way, because there are some hopeful things we're learning, even a place like Texas, that the vast majority of Americans do not support that deeper agenda of a takedown of public education and an erosion of any separation of church and state.
I will tell you that we found the same here in Western Pennsylvania. So we had a school district north of Pittsburgh called Pine Richland School District, where in 2021 and 2023, there were a number of people on the school board who got on. It was an 8-1 majority, and they spent months rewriting the library policy, demonizing the librarian to the point where she ended up retiring early. um, and made it so that they had complete control of the library, what they were able to pick and everything like that. And it turns out in 2025, that was such a visceral response from the community that they ended up voting all of those people out, and not just by small amounts. I mean, it was decisive and overwhelming. And we have seen that largely in Western Pennsylvania too. So
Yeah, and I remind
so,
people, sorry, I didn't mean to step on you there, but I remind people that since the
nope,
film's
you're fine.
released, I think that last year I physically went to 80 screenings in movie theaters and libraries, and there is not one state, and I think we have now screened in every state in the union. There's not one state where we haven't heard from librarians and people like you saying it's happening right here. So we let people know that, and it's under a very misleading guise, and that's part of what we try to encourage, is to remind people that prior to that fall, it's not like it was brand new. There were books that were challenged now and then, but as you know well, there was a protocol around it, and the protocol involved our trained professional librarians. And what this has been is a very blatant, and if people aren't really watching, they get away with it, which is a brazen breaking of every prior protocol that protects the books from just being taken off the shelf without review, sort of like no due process. I think a lot in terms of the books are like people who are being disappeared, like in the days of Argentina's The Disappeared. I think of it like immigrants that are being taken without due process. They personify something. And so that protocol was defied in so many different ways, not just in terms of the books, but the attack on the librarians themselves, the justification, which often using state penal code of obscenity to get around First Amendment kinds of protections, to, as you said, what I try to educate people is that it can be a very hyper local situation of how censorship takes root by way of the library boards and the school boards, and how people are able to be hired and fired, and removing librarians from the review process, so that the suggestion would be, let's just have the alt-right pastor down the street decide which books. So it's a very insidious thing, and it's under the guise of a vulnerable population of a lot of moms who are rightly so concerned about the protection of their children. It's a very vulnerable, easy place to go. Your kids are at risk. And by having this misinformation that there's obscenity in the grade schools. So, I've met very enlightened, self-ascribed liberals who have concern. But what about these books? And, I don't think it's about the books. I don't think I'm being overly dramatic in references in history to what this can be symptomatic of.
I mentioned in the beginning that I'm a parent. My child is in elementary school. And one of the rules that we've always had, he first started reading, similar to where Carrie talked about where her son got into Percy Jackson. Mine discovered the Dogman comics and has been just reading from there. And my rule of thumb has always been, I'm your parent. I get to decide what is appropriate and not appropriate for you to read.
That's right.
I'm not about to tell your friends or your classmates or anyone else what is appropriate for them to read. That is up to their parents. And I mean, having worked in public libraries, I have seen parents come in and say that, oh, this display that you have is inappropriate for children. or this book is not appropriate because it has X. And, one of the first things we always asked was, okay, but have you read it? Are you actually aware of what this book is actually talking about? Or are you just going based on talking points that you saw on like a local moms group online?
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation out there about what books are containing that is feeding the book bans. And ultimately, as parents, we know what is appropriate and not appropriate for our children. And we work with the teachers and the librarians to make sure that what our children are reading is not out of their grade level or out of their understanding.
And also this commandeering of language, of the
Yes.
vernacular of parental rights. There were always parental rights, as you say. Parents had a process by which to say, you know what, I've made a decision, I'd like to talk to the librarian. I don't want my child to read this, and that's fine. Or whether you make a challenge to remove the book, that negating the idea that the large majority of other parents like you don't have the parental rights. You're removing their rights to have their kids have a selection of materials that represent a diverse and dynamic society, which is the job of the librarian to keep um, to keep going each year.
Absolutely. And both Stefanie and I have experienced that as librarians on the other side. Like that's part of our code of ethics, really, that, we try to subscribe to ensuring that there are diverse and appropriate collections. But I want to go back to something you said just a minute ago before this, where you were talking about where you felt like you aren't necessarily overstating the comparisons from prior, I think, historical events. So, and I can think of several that are significant.
Oh, did we lose Carrie?
Carrie, are you frozen? There's a little internet connection issue.
All right, we might have lost her. I'll try and jump into the next question just to keep it going, and hopefully she will be able to come back in. So as Carrie was saying, you had mentioned about the idea about, we have a historical precedent for this type of things. And I also can think of many that have happened, but I think one of the ones that most people know is the video and pictures we see of the Nazis burning books by the people that they deemed to be not up to what society should be.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us to the question of, obviously in the film, you have footage of one of these Nazi book burnings in 1933, and you actually have that juxtaposed to footage of a modern day book burning that happened in Texas. And that juxtaposition is really an incredibly powerful scene in the film. What were you hoping your audiences would understand in watching that moment in the film?
Well, as you said, there are so many examples out of the playbook of historical references to totalitarian, authoritarian regimes and fascist regimes that go after the libraries and the librarians. We can go on and on, whether it be, Cambodia or the Cultural Revolution in China or Stalin or, there's just so many references. But of course, pointing to the 1933 book burning in Germany, I think before that was the famous Heinrich Heine quote, first they burn the books, and I think it was first they where they burn the books, they will ultimately burn people. And that was written, I think, in the 1890s. So that way predated 1933. But the reason, and I have to admit, one is always careful about, whether it be now in today's world, of making references to Nazi Germany, because sometimes it could seem like too obvious. One of the reasons I did it as a filmmaker is because Suzette, one of our characters, who's a military vet, shows me her little library, and she references and says, we know what these people are sounding like. And she starts reading to me from Goebbels. And, that together with the fact that we found this horribly disturbing footage, real footage, in Tennessee only a few years ago, with identical imagery of people throwing books into the fire. Those two things made me realize we have to go there. So we're hoping that people do see this outside of the context of culture wars in America and see it for what it is, which is a very, I don't know that there are any references without references to going after the books. There's actually a film right now that's nominated for an Academy Award this weekend called Mr. Nobody Against Putin. And it's kind of a parallel to this, of a small town teacher in Russia after the war, and the infiltration of indoctrination that he is being told he must deliver to school children. It happens every time. So it was really important to us that we make that historic parallel. And our librarians, and just as an aside, something very poignant happened in June. So the film came out in February. And in June, our Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, was fired. Well, the day after she was fired, we received, my team, a email from the German National Library saying, in light of this firing, we want you to know that there are hundreds of German librarians that are standing in solidarity with you in the United States, and we'd like you to come to Germany. And I did, with Martha from New Jersey, and we stood arm in arm in the freezing cold back in, I think it was November, with a number of German librarians, and then showed it to hundreds of librarians who were quietly so attentive, and little by little started to talk after, and reveal that this was, and we learned a lot in Europe, that this is happening outside of our borders. And so they, of all people, are very, very aware. I think this generation of a certain swath of German population of a certain age, or even not of a certain age, are very attentive and sensitive to this kind of activity. So that was really special. And they've invited us back to now screen in a bigger way in Leipzig at their a more main library, I think it is. So I'm actually thinking of doing that in May. But anyway, I just to say that that was important. And since I'm the group that we're speaking to, I will also tell you that for those who don't know it, there was a county, while we don't have it, we couldn't go into depth into all these things, a county in Tennessee that the board unanimously voted to ban mouse, based on, this is in the film, the fact that there's nudity of nude mice in a concentration camp. There's the banning of the graphic novel of Anne Frank. In our film, there's a Floridian librarian who points to a book called, which I've never read. I think it's is it The Librarian in Auschwitz? That she says this one has been challenged. So I say that because there's a lot of attention, as is appropriate, given the percentages of these books that are targeting LGBTQ and books about race. But I can tell you that secretly, in footage I couldn't really use in a middle school in Texas, when I asked the middle school librarian, she said, "Oh, Holocaust books, half this town are deniers. They don't want those books." So that's happening to those books as well.
Yeah, that first of all, I did not realize about the German librarians reaching out. I teared up at thinking about that. But what you just said, bringing up Mouse and the graphic novel version of Anne Frank, this brings us into our next question about how many people think book bans are primarily a First Amendment issue, which it has been. Any of the Supreme Court cases have been related to the First Amendment. However, your film also brings up deeper questions about the First Amendment and real religious freedom. How do you see censorship in public schools and public libraries connecting to the constitutional principle of separation in church and state? Because that, I will say, as a parent, but also a librarian, observing that has been a real problem here in Western Pennsylvania as well.
There are 3 references of the film I'm coming to. One is one in Louisiana with our librarian, Amanda Jones, where there's a board, a library, that's a public library at that point that we're in, with a whole board, and she's got a book up there that's supposed to help save lives of young gay people, called Queerfully Wonderfully Made, and it is designed to help at-risk youth. It is written by pastors, and they're in that scene trying to ban it and saying this is against scripture. This just goes against scripture. So the criterion, that's a scene that comes to me. We have this wonderful character, Adrian Quinn Martin, the hairdresser in Texas, who actually went on also outside of the film to receive the an award, it's an award by the Freedom of Religion Foundation. And she's just stellar in her town, and saying, there's a moment where she says, our schools are not your church. And so I think that is a very, I'd say racism and the desire to remove separation of church and state are the 2 main pillars that underlie a lot of what we see. And then one of my favorite characters who I traveled to the Rome Film Festival with is our librarian Marie in Manatee County, Florida, who is a devout Catholic. And she is the one who I have never met a librarian who has championed more for kids, and particularly kids who are marginalized and maybe questioning. She is a fierce defender of these books save lives and the importance of the separation of church and state. Despite the fact that she is a devout Catholic, she believes it's her calling, actually, to stand up for this. And she reminds us that this was our founding fathers came here to escape religious persecution, to have the freedom to believe in whatever religion they wanted. That's what this country was founded on, not the idea of imposing it on everyone else. So it does feel that part of what's happening in America definitely feels frightening to me on so many levels. As a citizen, as a Jewish person.
Yeah, I absolutely got.
No, go ahead, Carrie. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, I was going to say that I absolutely identify with that, because it isn't all of Christianity either. It's a very particular flavor that they're trying to impose on everyone. And, obviously I've seen it start out with Judaism, but now it seems to be expanding into Islam and other faiths. And it is extremely problematic. So it's something that I think, again, everyone needs to be aware of. And I say that as a non-Jew who has a degree in theology but feels so strongly about this that I have joined Jews for a Secular Democracy.
Carrie is a fantastic ally. I will say that. But I am Jewish, and when I was working at the public libraries, I had several of the other librarians inform me quite happily that I was the first Jew that they'd ever worked with. And there was definitely this like expectation, I think, that, oh, well, we're the same. You just go about it differently. And, that kind of ties into what you were saying about how imposing, religion into other people. There is a small minority that is doing that. And I don't even know that they're 100% aware that that is what they are doing. But they're so used to their beliefs being the majority that they just expect everyone else to follow suit. And that is why when I hear about stuff like Mouse being banned and the graphic novel of Anne Frank and all these different things, it's like these are important stories because it's telling a piece of history that we're losing.
I think I even heard A Tree Grows in Brooklyn at some point was
Mhm.
banned, right?
Yep.
These are, certainly in Jewish literary history, and how many authors, of course, were also, Suzette points out that in the 33 book burning, before they burned the Jewish authors, it was the LGBTQ plus. That's where the initial attack was. And so people like Thomas Mann, I think, was both gay and Jewish. So that's not new either.
No, and the LGBTQ plus population is actually the only population within Nazi Germany where may have had more people murdered than the Jews, because we actually don't know how many were killed in the camps. Because they were in the work camps as well, and so.
No, it should be alarming that over 65% of these books are very singularly attacking that. And as I said, I think it's a very calculated narrative about indoctrination. And what I always say to people is this word that you hear a lot, indoctrination, as if there is an agenda to things have gone too far in the culture wars, and there's an agenda to kind of indoctrinate kids. I think just like reclaiming the parental rights vernacular, I think we need to reinstate this idea of representation rather than indoctrination. One of our librarians pointed out that in her library, she counted in her 2,500 books how many books actually had gay characters, and it was less than 2%. She said, certainly that's what, in terms of representation, well below what, but I think the other thing people have to be very aware of is that in many of these cases, they are, I mentioned this before, using state penal code. Sometimes in audiences, people say, well, how are they getting away with this? There's Supreme Court precedent, there's First Amendment rights, but they're using state penal code which says that you can't distribute pornography or an obscenity. Well, who defines that? And for, me as a layperson, I learned several years ago the Miller test and things that librarians are trained to understand about definitions of obscenity. And there is not one librarian that I've met, and they're not all Democrats, they're not all left-leaning people, who would tell me that there's any of these books that in any way by those measures that are studied constitute obscenity or pornography. And what happens is that they target in on one paragraph in a 400 and some page beautiful literary book like Toni Morrison, which has been banned often. They don't point out that these are for age. Yes, they're difficult materials sometimes, but designed for the upper level kids, the 11th and 12th graders, and that there may be one passage. And I find it particularly offensive as a woman that often these are passages that contain sexual assault, because we all know that kids can find porn in a second on their internet. They do, I've met so many young women in Texas in that book banning club that said, this is how we learn in what that looks like. We actually learn what consent might look like and not look like. So there's a reason to understand why in times of slavery this happened. And a parent can decide, my 11th grader, I'm not sure they're ready for that. But that should be available, and certainly has been for some time in curriculum in those grade levels. So it becomes offensive when that, to me, a sexual assault in a book that's in our literary treasure trove is considered pornography or obscenity. So anyway, that's my rant on that piece of it.
No, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that was in fact used on several librarians here, where they in fact tried to write into the policy that the librarian would be arrested, even though Pennsylvania Penal Code directly states that librarians, gallery owners, artists, archivists, all of those belonging to what are the so-called glam professions, that they would be exempt. And it scared them so much that they, ultimately stepped away from the profession entirely. And we're talking 20, 25-year veterans of school librarianship, which is a real loss in a state where we already have decimated our school librarians more so than the rest of the nation. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Stefanie, because she's going to go ahead and field some of the questions that we've gotten in the chat now. But I'm glad that you touched on some of that fear that those librarians felt, which...
Yeah, and also that they have also thrown books about race under that umbrella of obscenity. So Suzette at one point, she's like, how is the history of the KKK pornography? It isn't. So that's what they've also gotten away with, is anything that is other suddenly is against state penal code.
All right, so we're going into the question and answers now. Is that my understanding? All right. So the first question we have is from Joan Weiss. And as a retired union organizer, my question is whether you've connected with unions representing public school librarians, for example, National Education Association, Seattle Education Association, etc., to have them screen your film to their members and possibly other union members, and also unions that may represent librarians who work for city or county libraries.
Well, Joan, thank you. You just read my mind. I was just about to ask, are librarians, do they have unions in Pennsylvania? Is a question I was going to ask you, Carrie. Are they
Oh, so
or
all of our...
I know it's state to state.
So all of our public school librarians are part of this either one of two school unions that we have here in Pennsylvania. So we have Pennsylvania School Educators Association, and then we also have another group that is part of AFT. But, conversely, not all of our public librarians are, and in fact, very few with the exception of those in the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh system, and those in the Philadelphia library system are unionized. So that gets a little trickier.
I ask because I did learn that in Texas that there is no protections. There is no union. In Florida, I believe as media specialists, they can be more protected despite all the bad laws about book banning under teachers unions, but not in Texas. And so one of the encouraging things about the kinds of things this film has been able to do is we learned that after a screening that I was not at in Ohio, I can't say exactly where, 680 librarians got together to start to organize around this question. So I would love any reference. I think it's a great idea for us to reach out and try to do screenings at the places that you're suggesting. So if there's a way to, from Joan, get that, I would love that. I so welcome that.
Absolutely. And I can tell you, I've already participated in one panel as a moderator that was held in that school district, Pine Richland. So we did a screening and a panel already. And then we'll also be showing this within the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh system, which is unionized, but we can connect you with others. So we have our next question is going back to where you were talking about women, and you were saying, it's really offensive that they're pointing out these books that have, passages about sexual assault and things. Why do you think, something I noticed both personally, but also in the film, is that it is almost exclusively women who, whether it's educators, librarians, parents, or just community members who have been the people who have spearheaded the fight against this, and defending these books, defending the librarians. Why do you think that is, and why do you think we as women should be standing up in this fight?
Well, Carrie, I would say on behalf of my posse of librarians that appear in the film, you wish you could put everything in the film, but we definitely had some great on-camera conversations about the misogyny that they feel is also a part of this. And they will point out that in a library, oftentimes there's a singular librarian. It's easy to sort of point and scapegoat one. It's the fault of the librarian. They're the gatekeeper of, as Audrey in our film points out, we are the firewall. And that is not lost on these more organized, I think, groups of go out, of course they're coming after the school librarians, was one line. So I think there is, I often thought about using clips from the Salem witch hunt, because it did feel so much like a, scarlet letter. And the more you dug into it, the more you were shocked that my librarians who were attacked were not, as you know well, this is happening everywhere in places where librarians are doing their job. It makes me so emotional. I always say this film for me is in the end about integrity. It's about you, whoever's a librarian in this group. In my industry, there's a lot of ego, there's a lot of people with ego, but, my impressions, not to generalize, in librarianship, there's a lot of people who are just, in the service of kids in public service. And in that, I think unwittingly, unknowingly found themselves now on the front lines for some who find, not all, because not all have the luxury, as you say, to fight this fight. And we understand that. But for those who can and will, I think it is so important, because there is a role. And I had a vision, not only that a Field of Dreams vision that came true, that this could be in theaters and libraries to spawn town hall conversations, and it's happening. We've done hundreds and hundreds. But I also had a kind of dream that when I started to study McCarthyism more, I learned, it's the obvious question is what dialed it back? What made us not go over that cliff?
that precipice. And the answer that I found was that McCarthy went after something, a bridge too far. It was too sacrosanct, and it was the military and what they represented. And I had this dream that librarians, for a lot of Americans, if we could revive that understanding in that, that's why I used all that footage of these days of what, have we come to this where we're actually thinking about criminalizing librarians for doing what they're trained to do. And part of it is upholding democracy and the access to information and freedom to read. If I could pierce through and show librarians in that light, which I feel that's why it struck a nerve. How cool would it be to grow what we're doing with our campaign, which you can learn more about at librariansfilm.com, but about Librarians Without Borders. I've really been using that phrase a lot because I think doctors, we know they do that. They show up beyond politics. It's not about politics because they take an oath to save lives. And I think a lot of, like you said, it's a code of ethics to uphold these very important democratic values in a society. So if they could be on the forefront and armed with this film, that's what we're doing, and we're very excited about not being partisan, but we're excited about the prospect in 26. There's so many Americans who I think they are just not having it, and we're seeing signs of that even in Texas. So I feel that we have an opportunity with the film to encourage people. You have to show up at your school board races, your elections, your library boards. You must get hyper locally involved. Run for your school board, run for your library board, but become a watchdog, because this is an issue that you actually can have agency. There's so many we don't have right now in stuff going on in this country, but you actually can affect censorship like a germ, I think. Sometimes you can't, but sometimes you can.
No, I absolutely agree. And, I've told people, so I very briefly, I left my librarian job and did full-time advocacy because of book bans coming to Western Pennsylvania from 2022 to 2025. And one of the things I would say is, do I look like a groomer to you? Do I look like a pedophile? And so I used my privilege as this very sweet looking middle-aged white woman to point out, maybe you might be wrong. Maybe it isn't the librarian that's the issue. So yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have had similar interactions. All right.
And there's really cool stories. I've learned more and more about the role of librarians during World War II. And, there are interesting examples in history of how librarians have come together during McCarthyism as well. So I think there's ancestry here in a reason to carry on that great tradition of women getting involved and standing up for these things.
I was gonna say, if anyone is interested to learn more about the roles of librarians and archivists and historians and all that in World War II, look into the Monuments Men. I know men is in the title, but there was a lot of women who were also working in that movement. And a lot of them are the ones that have since been recognized as the one as saving a lot of the books and the museum materials and everything from the Nazis during World War II. So if anyone's interested in learning more about the roles of librarians in World War II, it's the Monuments Men. So we're going to move on to our next question, just because I know we are coming up on time here. So this is from one of our attendees, which is, what can we do if we are in a place where our local politician has chosen to bully us to removing books off of our shelves? And what happens to our librarians whose livelihoods are maybe threatened? What if you don't have the resources to hire a law firm to represent you or your community and defend your freedom of choice?
Well, I'm going to let Carrie help me here, but I will quickly say that two things we've seen is that we've partnered with PEN America, and there is a reporting, I think, place to report these kinds of things. But also, just anecdotally, we understand that there are lots of librarians who are not in the position to go out on a limb for many reasons. Therefore, the chilling effect that we understand is real, with no judgment. But, in the case of that, we have seen cases, that one librarian in Colorado who have won, in situations like this that are encouraging. I'm not going to say they were easy journeys. Amanda just won a lawsuit. Suzette in our film won her suit of defamation. In terms of, in the case of Amanda, it was pro bono. I'm not suggesting that, risks are such a personal thing. Carrie, do you have anything to add to that about?
So there are, I will say that there are groups. So I worked for a group called Red, Wine, and Blue.
That's right,
And
red, white,
they
and blue.
so they have something called Book Ban Busters, and they will help from the advocacy side, like you mentioned, PEN America. So they have a place to report it. The Office of Information, OIF, Office of Information Freedom, Intellectual Freedom, I'm sorry, with the American Library Association. They can assist, but then also there are different pro bono groups, obviously ACLU, which is pretty overwhelmed right now. Democracy Forward is another. And then if you are in Pennsylvania and experiencing this, we have something called the Education Law Center, and they are keenly interested and have assisted here. But yeah, so there are lots of resources out there, but it can be a long slog. So it's not necessarily an easy road. And then, of course, Jews for a Secular Democracy has been great too.
And Carrie, I know that we've worked a lot with Freedom to Read groups in Texas, Florida with Stefanie, Utah, Utah Root. Is there the equivalent of that in Pennsylvania?
Yes, there are Freedom to Read groups that have sprung up in local school districts, primarily where a lot of the book banning has occurred. But then, again, groups like Jews for a Secular Democracy, they have promoted it and assisted. Red, Wine, and Blue has also assisted, and a number of other grassroots groups have chimed in as well. So there are resources out there for people experiencing this, either at the library level or the curriculum level for schools. But this is actually the perfect segue into what was going to be our last question, which was, what can you do? And you already said, go ahead and advocate at the school board level, or also the library board level if it's a public library and they have that. But also get involved with some of these grassroots groups that do address book banning and censorship, and also religious freedom and taking on Christian nationalism. So those are all important things, I think.
And it's not to plug the film, but now that it is been on PBS, we find that you can either watch it, by yourself, but for a window now online, it is free on PBS YouTube channel. But one thing we're asking people to do is, a lot of people have book clubs. Have a screening. It can be free, other than telling people to have a potluck. Have a screening and become a kind of watchdog of, for like learn in your community what's going on in the school board. Take it on yourself. Have a screening and, try to get, it's like a politician friend of mine, and bring six, don't just show up yourself, get other people to understand who the people, I've had people stand up in screenings and say, that woman running for the school board, she's running under a pro-education. But if you really look, she's not that. She's secretly a Moms for Liberty operative. Like, you learn things, and so become educated about who these people are, because oftentimes the school board is like a gateway to getting into higher positions. Even though the school board is not, a partisan thing, it's often a way for extremists to start their path. So have the screening, and become that person who can take this on. I feel like right now, I'll just say, in our country, when I get overwhelmed, I get excited that I wake up and there's something that can motivate me. And I think whatever it be, I tell my young friends this, if we all sweep our own little corner, and don't get overwhelmed by, oh my God, and there's this and there's the war, and, just pick something and sweep your own little corner. We can, I really do believe we can prevail in these times.
I think I am gonna jump in now because we're unfortunately that hour went amazingly fast. I really want to thank you, Kim, for joining us. If someone asked what is the name of the film, it is called The Librarians. You can find it on her website. Kim, what is the website again?
Librariansfilm.com, but right now you can go to PBS, a YouTube channel. There's a YouTube channel. If you just Google that, you can find it, and spread the word. Tell everyone, not because we profit off that, because we want everyone in the world to see it.
Absolutely. Spread the word. Knowledge is also action. So please, please spread the word. So thank you, Kim. I want to thank Carrie and Stefanie. I want to thank the Jewish Women's Foundation of Greater Pittsburgh, the Carnegie Library, for our Pittsburgh friends. Sign up for the March 19th in-person screening of The Librarians. It will be at the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. I already put the link in the chat, but I will send you more. On March 29th, we are hosting, actually, Stefanie and Carrie are moderating, are calling a banned book bingo game. It's actually a couple games. It's really fun. It's family friendly. Bring your kids. And then again, watch this on PBS if you're not going to be there in Pittsburgh.
And I was going to say, people can come to the website if they want to do a screening that is more in their library or somewhere that's a more eventized public thing. Write to us on the website and we can help figure that out.
Perfect. And if people want to host a banned book bingo game, write to me and we'll help you do that. And we'll also help you do a screening and connect with them. If you want to email me, I will email them and connect you all. Thank you, everyone. One more thing before you all leave. We are going to have a special call with us next month about banned books. So keep your eye posted for that as well. And on that note, I am going to say good night to everybody. Have a wonderful night. Thank you again, Kim. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the work you're doing and for everybody who participated.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.